Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kutub.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, this week, US President Joe Biden will be hosting a special summit with ASEAN head of states in Washington, D.C., and this will be the first in-person meeting since 2017. This comes as April 24th marked 1 year since ASEAN signed the 5-point consensus, which was supported by the US and the international community. But why has it failed to make inroads? Let's speak to our guest today. She is Debbie Stoddard. She is the founder of the democracy advocacy group, Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. Debbie, I'm just going to look at some statistics that the UN has put out that since the coup, the junta has killed more than 1,800 civilians. They've arrested over 13,000 people and destroyed over 8,000 homes. The coup has displaced nearly half a million people and sent 48,000 fleeing to India and Thailand, neighboring countries. Now, beyond the statistics, Debbie, I was hoping we could begin our conversation today by perhaps understanding what the numbers mean, what the situation on the ground is in Myanmar now, I think some 16 months since the coup.
Hi, Melissa. The UN actually put out a report at the end of last year anticipating that 26% of Burma, Myanmar's population will need urgent assistance this year. What that means is that 1 in 4 people is already in desperate humanitarian need because this military junta has inflicted nearly 11,000 attacks on civilians and also engaged in armed clashes that harmed civilians since the coup started in February last year. And what that means also is that many civilian communities, including farmers, have not been able to grow food because they've been subjected to artillery fire and airstrikes. So what is also quite horrifying is that if we look at the tiny state of Kaya Karenni on the eastern border with Thailand, this Burmese state has been subjected to multiple airstrikes and artillery fire. The illegal junta actually launched airstrikes on the state capital. I think, and more than half of the population of that state have been displaced by violence more than twice. So to imagine this scale, just imagine Putrajaya orders an airstrike on Georgetown in Penang, and half of Penang's population is displaced repeatedly because of bombings and airstrikes. That's actually what it is like for people in the country.
So, Debbie, those statistics are horrific. We learn about, some of the best hospitals in Myanmar having been destroyed and targeted attacks on doctors because doctors have provided some of the main resistance to the junta. All that accumulation of facts, how does it move the needle in terms of responses, both with outside and within, which I think is the point, in some sense, the point of this conversation. We know it's horrific, but is it changing the dynamics, especially for international actors?
Well, it's certainly split ASEAN. Let's face it, ASEAN was somewhat split over the way it kind of fell apart over the regional response to COVID. Everyone just went back into their borders and started thinking of watching out for themselves instead of thinking about how do we address COVID as a region. Now, with what happened with the coup that started in February last year, we could already start to see a split in perspectives. For example, Cambodia, which is the current chair of ASEAN, is much more inclined to support the illegal military junta, whereas Malaysia is taking a very different view of the situation, looking at the fact that, number one, the government, the National Unity Government formed of elected MPs, is not recognized by ASEAN, but Malaysia is willing to have informal engagement because this is part of an international norm that recognizes democratically elected governments above illegal military juntas. Whereas Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and Vietnam are more likely to work more closely with the military, the illegal military junta in Burma, because they themselves are averse to democratization.
Debbie, can I ask you about humanitarian aid? So again, coming back to the figures and the situation on the ground as you've painted, is humanitarian aid that has been promised, has that been reaching people? There's been a lot of discussion about increasing humanitarian aid, but is it going to the right people? Is it actually helping?
Good point, Melissa. Cambodia hosted a consultation on humanitarian aid to Myanmar last week on May the 6th, and that turned out to be a little bit of a controversial disaster because Cambodia's view was that we should be pushing money into Myanmar under the control of the illegal junta to address the humanitarian crisis, without acknowledging, firstly, that the root cause of this crisis is the violence and mismanagement of the military junta, which has actually destroyed humanitarian aid or blocked aid from reaching civilians severely affected by the violence. So what we are seeing now is this very unrealistic view in one side of ASEAN saying, let's give whatever aid and whatever help possible to this junta, and hopefully they will they will fight it out, they'll become stronger, and then yes, people will die, but the junta will then be in control of the whole country, and we have stability and we know who to work with. Whereas countries like Malaysia, including the Malaysian Foreign Minister Dato Saifuddin Abdullah, is of the view that that actually was going to create a bigger threat to human security in the region, because if the junta becomes more violent and more repressive, we will not be able to hold back the tides of millions of people who will be fleeing out of sheer desperation. We've already had people seeking assistance and seeking asylum across in India, in China, in Thailand. But if we do not actually ensure that we start border-based aid that helps the people who are most affected by this violence, people gathered on the borders with Thailand and India, for example, then what we are doing is essentially adding to the pressure, and that pressure will blow up in all our faces.
Debbie, there's some headline stories about defections from the military, but how significant are they, and how do they impact also stories of armed resistance against the junta, something the junta has in some interesting ways turned against ASEAN and the Malaysian position, saying that Malaysia's willingness to speak to the NUG is tantamount to supporting terrorism in that country.
Well, the reality of the situation is that the People's Defense Force and other locally constituted resistance groups have done it because no one is able to be, there's no civilian protection on the ground. Nobody is defending or protecting local people who are being starved of even water and food by the military junta. So what we are seeing is the emergence of local groups with very little arms actually trying to hold off military attacks so that civilians can flee safely. But if you want to talk about terrorism, and terrorism is a very easy word that's used by the military junta. It's not these local resistance groups that have inflicted massacres like the Demoso Christmas massacre, where the junta actually captured 40 men, women, and children and burnt them alive. So, the atrocity crimes that we're seeing, the war crimes that we're seeing in the country are mostly, the majority of it being perpetrated by these illegal junta because they have much more weapons. They have been buying thousands of missiles and arming and rearming themselves in order to go after civilians. and these resistance groups. And when we talk about the military calling these people terrorists, they have been willing to impose death sentence in absentia on elected MPs simply because these elected MPs joined the national unity government. If the military junta is saying, no, we will not talk to these people, then it very much goes against the spirit and content of ASEAN's 5-point consensus, which is about engaging all sides to the situation. I think,
Right.
I think the big problem, the big challenge in ASEAN is the a splitting of ASEAN into groups that would rather stay in their comfort zone and deal with the status quo and actually feel much more comfortable dealing with a repressive regime. And the other part of ASEAN, the more established part of ASEAN that understands that ASEAN needs to be a rules-based organization. There are some principles and red lines that must not be crossed in ASEAN.
Well, that's precisely what we want to talk to you about with the 5-point consensus. Let's come back, Debbie, and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutin. Let's continue our conversation with Debbie Stoddard from the Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. This ahead of the US-ASEAN Special Summit in Washington, D.C. this week, with the ongoing violence in Myanmar expected to be discussed during the summit. I want to begin there, Debbie. I'm just wondering, what opportunities do you see in the upcoming Special Summit in D.C. this week, particularly since there's been a lot of criticism over the 5-point consensus that it has, after a year, failed to make any significant inroads in addressing the 5 points in its plan?
I think it's pretty clear that the best outcome possible at the US-ASEAN Summit when it comes to Burma, Myanmar is an agreement that ASEAN needs to step up its work and take a more principled approach in the way it deals with the situation in Burma, Myanmar. And even if we were to take the lowest common denominator, which is a concern for regional human security, it's pretty much clear that supporting the perpetrators and the root cause of the crisis is actually going to make the situation worse. And this is where the possibility of a partnership between key ASEAN members and the US is possible. If they were able to come up with a partnership to ensure there's border-based aid, for example, to provide assistance to those communities that need it, not just the ethnic nationalities along the border who have traditionally already been affected by ongoing conflict, but they are also dealing with refugees from the center, people fleeing the main cities of the country because these cities have been subjected to battlefield tactics and attacks, even on hospitals and schools and civilians. Even the military has even been abducting children from kindergarten in order to grab their parents. So it's this type of whole-scale violence. So the border area is now overloaded with people, not just the ethnic people being subjected to airstrikes, but also people fleeing the urban centers. And this is why it would be best if the US-ASEAN Summit at least came up with a joint agreement to open up border-based assistance as a start.
Right. So you already understand that Joe Biden, President of the United States, had signed into law the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, which I believe puts money behind support for democracy in Burma. What impact has that had? How far will Joe Biden go in trying to persuade ASEAN to take tougher steps against Myanmar? Or is he going to, in fact, seek guidance from ASEAN in order to shape a US policy?
I think let's be frank. The 5-point consensus will be dead in the water. It's already controversial. It's on its last legs. It hasn't been able to deliver anything moving forward. None of the points of the 5-point consensus have been achieved so far. So if ASEAN wants to save face and resuscitate this 5-point consensus, they are actually going to have to deliver a way forward in ensuring there's comprehensive political engagement with all sides involved in the situation in Burma, that they are able to ensure delivery of humanitarian assistance to those communities that need it, and actually that we're moving forward on some type of sustainable peace agreement. So in order for all of that to move forward, we need to still abide by international humanitarian law and those principles. I don't think, given that President Biden has taken such a strong stand on the Ukraine, I don't think he's going to be flip-flopping and saying, yes, ASEAN, I'll do whatever you want on Burma. There's going to have to be an active, principled negotiation about what US and ASEAN can do together moving forward. And ASEAN will lose the initiative, will lose the ability to lead on this solution if they're refusing to actually deal with a solution.
You mentioned Ukraine. I'm just wondering, Debbie, whether the global preoccupation with the Ukraine crisis has actually provided the junta with perhaps a layer of cover from greater international scrutiny from what they've been doing in the past few months.
Well, let's not forget, if you're talking about Ukraine, that one of the biggest enablers of this illegal military junta in Burma has actually been Russia and Putin's administration. They are the main suppliers of weapons. They are the main suppliers of political support, sometimes even more actively supporting the junta than even neighboring China. So, there are some very interesting connections here. And there's also a reality. In ASEAN, when the coup happened and people have been under attack, they've been subjected to atrocity crimes, ASEAN countries were preoccupied about preventing refugees from arriving in ASEAN countries, and some ASEAN countries were actually trying to push back pre-existing refugees. Whereas in Ukraine, we saw many parts of Europe opening up to receive refugees and a very strong political commitment, both from EU and the US. In ASEAN, the response to Burma, whether it's aid, US and the EU and other other dialogue partners trying to support people affected by the humanitarian crisis in Burma, are being actually blocked by ASEAN, including Thailand. So we've actually seen ASEAN, instead of saying, hey, everybody, let's work together to help address this issue, which ultimately affects us directly, basically saying, don't help. Just try and keep everything contained within Myanmar's borders and see what happens. If people die, so be it. That's the attitude, as long as we don't have to do anything about it. But Burma-Myanmar situation is a pressure cooker. The pressure is increasing. The violence hasn't let up. The economic chaos is much worse now. 75% of the banks are shut down. So what we are facing is a multi-layered humanitarian crisis that if we are unable to address it now, it's ASEAN that's going to be paying the price in the long term.
So Debbie, we look to external actors to push the plot along, as it were, for Myanmar. But what about internally? You've spoken about energy, you've spoken about some of the armed conflict, but is the military unshakable?
So anyway, Sharat, you raised the question of defections. We've seen thousands of police and military, including high-ranking officials, leaving the military junta simply because they couldn't stomach what they were being commanded to do, to kill unarmed civilians, including young people and people in urban areas. You see, the military are used to killing unarmed ethnic groups and ethnic communities in the border areas. They are not actually used to being told to kill fellow Burmans, people of the same ethnicity and same religion. In addition, many people join the military for economic opportunities, and they've gradually started to see that the economic opportunities for the military have been shrinking rapidly. Instead of having the economic protection of being in the military, military families are now being told to subject the wives and the children of soldiers to military training. Veterans are being told to return from retirement to go fight on behalf of the military. There's actually a group called People's Embrace that actively support and invite the military and police to defect, and they have been extremely effective. Even junta leaders, Min Aung Hlaing's personal speechwriter, has also defected to the other side.
Debbie, in the last few minutes that we have left, I want to ask you, I mean, we understand that you have decades of experience working as an activist and advocacy in this space. I think about 30 years of experience. Can I ask you, when you said that it's a pressure cooker situation and you're concerned that without urgent action, the dynamics could shift, what then should Malaysia's role be to help reduce some of the pressure? What can Malaysia, what can Saifuddin, what can Wisma Putra do to help, especially in view of the upcoming summit this week?
The Malaysian Foreign Minister has already called for ASEAN to ensure that the UN Special Envoy, Dr. Noeleen Heyzer, who is actually a Singaporean, is recognized by the military junta and is allowed to visit the country and engage with all stakeholders there. He's also expressed concern about the humanitarian situation, and it's pretty clear that Malaysia needs to take the lead in terms of persuading Thailand to allow border-based aid to reach communities that are most in urgent situation. I think Malaysia can be the voice of reason when it comes to dealing with the crisis in Myanmar. And
Debbie, do you think that the voice has been urgent enough, that Malaysia has done enough?
I think Malaysia needs to do more, of course, but Malaysia also needs to work more, team up with Indonesia and other like-minded states who understand the threat to regional human security posed by the situation in Burma, Myanmar. But at the same time, while the foreign minister is doing a lot of strong and principled advocacy, we are facing another crisis domestically, because his words and his approach is not matched by the Home Affairs Ministry in Malaysia, for example, who insists on detaining men, women, and children who are basically refugees of the crisis in the country.
Right. Debbie, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We appreciate your time. That was our conversation with Debbie Stoddard from Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kudin, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.